Hi everybody, meteorologist Joe Chaffee. Welcome to the Joe Chaffee Weather Show, August the 26th, 2019. And we are watching, of course, Tropical Storm Dorian as it is getting very close to the Windward Islands, particularly Barbados. Last advisory from the Hurricane Center, 60 nautical miles southeast of Barbados and 165 miles east-southeast of St. Lucia. Top winds are 60 miles an hour, moving west-northwest at 14, and the lowest pressure, 1,002 millibars, 29.59 inches. So it's kind of a mid-range tropical storm, and we've got some interesting satellite loops to look at in just a moment. One of the things I want to emphasize here with respect to this particular storm, and that is its size. It doesn't cover a lot of geography. When you look at the storm itself on a satellite loop, particularly on a tight picture, it looks big, when in reality you may be seeing it only over a scope of a couple of hundred miles. And the Hurricane Center points out in their marine advisory, for example, that the radius of gales is not all that wide. In fact, they've got some errors here on their advisory. It looks like they're missing some numbers. I got to pull up the previous one because the old one had usually on the marine advisory, it does tell you the extent of gales. Okay. I see what I did. Okay. I had we also have a new tropical. We have the tropical depression 6, which formed southeast of the Carolina coast, about 300 miles southeast of Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. We're going to get to that also a little bit later on. But the gales here on Dorian only go out 20 nautical miles, the gales go 40 miles to the northeast, 40 miles to the southeast, 20 miles to the southwest, and 40 miles to the northwest. It's a very, very tight system. And the 50-knot winds, which you're only going to see a small wind field with this anyway because top winds are 55, so 20 nautical miles to the northeast and 20 nautical miles to the northwest. So literally it's like hitting a target. It could pass within 30, if it passes just south of Barbados by a handful of miles in terms of where the center is, they may not even see gales there. So I'm just using that as an illustration. It'll probably come close enough where they would see some gales, but you get 30, 40 miles away from where the storm is when they're this small, you wind up seeing very little in the way of weather. So just bear that in mind as we move along here, because the way the environment is with this particular tropical system, we have the possibility that in its life cycle, it will always seem to remain a relatively small cyclone. And the problem is that there's a lot of dry air around, and we're going to show you that on the loops. PRJ Grudge. Thanks for hitting Super Chat tonight. Really appreciate it. A couple of cigars for me. Thank you so much. And also from earlier, Christopher hitting Super Chat. Thank you very much. Appreciate when you guys do that. Gets me a cup of coffee or a beer and a couple of cigars on my downtime, and I'm very much a happy camper. So let's start with the enhanced satellite loop here. And these are all, by the way, accessible from the National Hurricane Center's website. To just hit data, the data tab, and you just hit satellite, and you can pick up all the storm sectors. But it's a tight little storm. It actually has a fairly, and all through the last day or two, it's had a very impressive core. It's a small core, but it's a core nonetheless. And it's holding together quite well. And sometimes with these small storms, you have to be very careful, because when they are in their own environment, in a sense, because they're so small, they can do some weird things. They can suddenly strengthen very rapidly, and at the same time, if conditions become unfavorable, they can weaken very, very rapidly. And we're going through a loop here going through late this afternoon and into this evening, you can see the colder cloud tops that burst out during the evening hours, right near where the center is. So the system is actually fairly well defined, and it would not shock me at all to see this becoming a hurricane. So we're seeing it now heading up into the islands. We also want to point out they have issued a tropical storm watch for the island of Puerto Rico. We have watches up, a hurricane watch up for St. Lucia, which this storm is in the path of St. Lucia. We'll get that public advisory up again. I'm on two computers at the same time. The hurricane watch up for St. Lucia. The storm is 165 miles east-southeast of there. Tropical storm warnings for Barbados, Martinique, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and the Grenadines. And watches are up for Dominica, Grenada and its dependencies, Saba, and St. Eustatius, and Puerto Rico. So the threat for Puerto Rico is one, of course, now being ultra sensitive with what happened with Hurricanes Irma and Maria back a few years ago, and also for the Virgin Islands as well. So I'm sure they're on heightened alert, hoping that this thing winds up passing to the south, or possibly even weakening when it's in the Northeast Caribbean, because I'm still not 100% sure what's going to happen when it gets in there with regards to the wind shear. We have the GFS now is the only model that seems to be showing a significant amount of wind shear. The European and the GFS were going hand in hand with this, but the European last night backed away from that idea and has a much more favorable environment going forward. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out, and we're going to be watching satellites closely tomorrow to see any evidence of shear. Now here's the water vapor imagery, the mid-level water vapor imagery. The yellow, that's all the dry air that's around it. And remember, this is a really small storm. Each one of these boxes is 5 degrees of longitude, so you see where 10 north is, and you can see where 15 degrees north is. So you can pretty much fit the entire storm in a 300 by 300 box, 300 mile by 300 nautical mile by 300 nautical mile box, in terms of the extent of the high clouds on the edge, and then the smaller core that's right near the middle. And the water vapor imagery certainly shows that smaller core, but the yellow is that dry air. And what's been happening is that some of that dry air has been getting entrained in the circulation from time to time. So you've been getting these sort of fits and spurts with regards to strengthening, even though when we look at the upper level winds and the upper air setup, the conditions would normally be favorable for this system to strengthen steadily, or possibly even strengthen rapidly for a time. But that dry air is definitely getting in the way, and you got a ton of it just to the north as you head up north of 15 degrees north, and also to the northwest as you run up toward the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. One of the things that's happened this afternoon, there's a bit of a band that's trying to develop a tropical feeder band that extends southward into South America, and you can see the moisture feed is trying to connect there, and that might perhaps add a little bit more juice to this as it goes west-northwestward. And don't be surprised if we do see this wind up getting into a minimal hurricane strength if it gets into one of these bursts and the dry air doesn't get too much in the way. So a lot here to watch, obviously, with the storm threatening these islands and moving on a steady course, 14 miles an hour. It'll move on through, and we're not looking at what we saw back a few years ago with Irma and Maria, where these islands were facing a category 5 buzzsaw coming on through. This is not anything quite like that. So that's a big plus. So here's the Hurricane Center's forecast track. You can see where the watches and warnings are. And of course, you can access this by going to nhc.noaa.gov. They actually do strengthen it to a hurricane when it gets into the Northeast Caribbean and clears the islands. A lot of these islands, by the way, have mountainous terrain if you've never been there, and they can disrupt the circulations of these storms as they go by. The Hurricane Center is actually forecasting this to be of hurricane strength south of Puerto Rico, and then kind of finding its way through between Puerto Rico and the eastern portion of the Dominican Republic, weakens it to a tropical storm. So it just barely brings it inland, then takes it back out over the open waters, and then moves it into the Bahamas. Now, if it survives this trip, and it gets into the Bahamas, conditions up here when it gets here should be quite favorable for strengthening. You're going to have very, very light winds aloft, very light wind shear off the Florida coast and out to the Bahamas. So if it makes it up there, you could wind up seeing this thing gain strength relatively quickly once it clears the terrain of the Dominican Republic. And of course, the other thing is, in terms of the forecast motion, and I'll show you this on the when we do when we look at the models. There's going to be a building upper high in the South Atlantic to the northeast of this storm, and it's going to be building back westward. So this is going to force this to move on a west-northwest to northwest track pretty much through its life cycle, and it may just keep on going on that track if we extend this out beyond Saturday. So when you're looking at this, if you're watching this from Florida, I'm sure you're seeing, oh, here, they got it getting close to Florida in their 120-hour forecast. Of course, you see where the quote cone of uncertainty is and how far it spreads out. So obviously, you should certainly be paying attention to this. At this point, it's very hard to say what exactly we're going to be dealing with in terms of a system, because if wind shear becomes a factor here and winds up taking this apart when it's in the Northeast Caribbean, or if it takes a track a little bit further to the west and crosses the Dominican Republic the longer way, through that mountainous terrain, you may have a pretty ragged system when it comes out on the other side. And sometimes you can have the best of conditions for strengthening, but the mountainous terrain takes such a toll on these storms that it makes it very tough for them to come back to their original intensities. There have been instances, and certainly in the last number of years, there have been quite a few instances of storms that have defied that. But there's also a long history of storms that they get ripped apart by wind shear, or they get ripped apart by mountainous terrain, or possibly both, and you wind up with a ragged system afterward, even though everything says that it should intensify. Now, here's an interesting model to look at. So actually a group of models. This is some of the intensity guidance that the Hurricane Center has, and it's run 4 times a day. All this courtesy, by the way, of Levi Cowan of TropicalTidbits.com, which is the website I use for a lot of the maps that you see. But what's interesting is that you do have most of the models keeping this at tropical storm strength out over the next 5 days. We have a handful of models that actually bring it to Category 1 status, and we've got one that takes it up to a Category 2. We also have a couple of models that weaken it in the next 36 to 72 hours. And that could be, those models might be looking at this and saying, hey, there's wind shear going to be going on in the Northeast Caribbean, and Dorian's going to be running into that. But the vast majority, the consensus, keeps this as a tropical storm between 45 and 60 knots over the next 5 days. I want to also, as a disclaimer, with these intensity models, obviously you can pick and choose which one you think might be the one that's correct, or you can just average it all out. The bottom line is that that's not really the most ideal way to forecast something like this. You could very easily be on the upper end of the envelope and also be on the lower end of this envelope, particularly because this is such a small storm with a solid core. It can surprise in both directions. Now, the latest run of hurricane tracking models this afternoon takes it through the Windward Islands and then starts to bend it a little bit more to the northwest and gets it. Some of the models take it right over Puerto Rico. Others take it over the western part of the Dominican Republic, or even further to the west of that. Then most of them, except for one, take it into the Bahamas going forward. And you do have a handful of models, the ones that go out far enough in time, run this up across South Florida, coming in southeast Florida, and then moving across and then moving out on the other side. Again, these are the model forecasts. They are not the specific forecasts, and you certainly should not base, by the way, any kind of decisions that you make when it comes to tropical systems by looking at maps like this. You really should make sure you follow the National Hurricane Center's forecast, and of course your local officials when it comes to decision making. And I would say that also that covers anything that I say here. I'm here giving you my perspective and clarifying certain things that might be confusing to you. Perhaps I may say some things that may confuse you even more. The bottom line is you go to your local National Weather Service office, you go to the National Hurricane Center's website, and you talk to local officials if that ever becomes an issue. So the models are certainly pointing in this direction. So let's take a look. I want to show you the upper air as to what's happening. And I'm going to go close up. I'm going to give you the broad view first. This is the latest GFS model run. And you are starting with this evening where we have a wrapped up upper low sitting over Nova Scotia with a non-tropical storm bringing some heavy rains to, at least as of this evening, the eastern parts of Nova Scotia and on up eastward toward Newfoundland. That wrapped up upper low brought some dry air down into the north, another shot of dry air down into the northeast today. Meanwhile, we're seeing a stronger upper low over Lake Winnipeg with a trough that extends down into the northern plains. Across the Atlantic, you have an upper high that's centered out between Bermuda and the Azores. Actually, the northern part of that high is running right along 40 degrees north. And you also, you're pretty much in a ridge position all across the tropical and subtropical Atlantic. Now, we are going to see a trough drop down into the east as we go into Wednesday and Thursday. But take a look at what happens off the southeast coast of the U.S. You've got this big upper high that suddenly appears. And what's going to happen is that you're going to probably wind up seeing as this upper high builds, Dorian is going to respond to that by moving west-northwest to northwest and basically running underneath it. Particularly as we go into Friday and the weekend, it really gets strong and builds back toward the South Carolina coast. So the alleyway is right through the Bahamas if this verifies. And I think this is going to verify to a large extent. Maybe in the small details it might not be exact, but the idea is there. And going into Saturday, that ridge is even stronger. So you've got a southeast steering flow coming from the southeast, running from the Dominican Republic to the Bahamas to Florida. So it would seem that the alleyway is being created here for a pathway. Again, what do we have when it gets there in terms of a system? Is it going to be strong? The Hurricane Center has been leaning on the bullish side, and or does it get sheared out? Do the mountains of the Dominican Republic do a number on this? I'm going to bring up the paint box as soon as it decides to open up. There we go. And I'll show you again going into Friday. I'm going to bring up a tight view of the upper air. And here we go. So this is we're looking at the 500 millibar level, 18,000 feet, and we're going to try to figure out what the steering is going to be. So here's our upper high sitting out, and remember, this is going to be getting stronger with time. We're at 2 a.m. Friday morning, so you've got this upper high here, and your flow. Now at this point, by Friday, you're looking at, I just want to make sure I got the right view. By Friday, it's already in the Bahamas. So your upper flow is pretty much clockwise around highs, folks. So your upper air steering is coming in from the southeast. So if you've got Dorian sitting somewhere in here as a tropical storm, or perhaps a strong tropical storm, or even a minimal hurricane, or it might even be a depression, depending again what happens when it crosses these islands. But the pathway is certainly there with this upper high that's off the Atlantic. You've got another upper high that's kind of built back westward across Texas into Louisiana. So this is the spot somewhere in, in general, I'll have to extend it further south, but this is the opening, the alleyway in between the two highs and that southeast steering flow that is going to be prevalent for the latter part of the week and beyond. And here we are taking a look. I got the tight view now of the GFS, as I'll bring that back so you can see it. So here's the tight view, and now that upper high has gotten even stronger, and actually it's merged to some degree with that high over Texas. So this is not something that is going to recurve and go out to sea, and the reason for that is, well, you got this big ridge in the middle, and it's basically a brick wall. The southern end of the jet stream, we've been talking about how the southern end of the jet stream has been getting pretty far south into Virginia and North Carolina. Well, the westerly winds in the upper atmosphere, the southern extent of those westerly winds running across Kentucky and Virginia out into the open waters of the Atlantic well north of Bermuda. So that upper high is really going to be the key here in terms of what happens down the road with Tropical Storm Dorian. Now, we also have a new tropical depression out in the Atlantic, and this one is out about 300 or so miles southeast of Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. I have a really tight view of this satellite loop, and you can actually see the low-level circulation that has developed. It's on the edge of the convection. There's convection that is running east and southeast of the actual circulation center. There isn't very much going on to the north and to the northwest. So we got the low-level center going, and if you think back to Chantal, it kind of happened the same way. We noticed on the satellite the day before that there was a low-level center, but not a whole lot of convection going on. This one actually has a little bit more convection, a bit closer to the center. Now, if we wind up seeing that convection in the other quadrants begin to develop and wrap around a bit, then we may see this get upgraded to a tropical storm. But the one thing that is different with this is the fact that since it's happening now at the very beginning part of the week, the steering along the East Coast is a lot different. And you'll notice that you've got clouds going west to east across the Carolinas and out into the open waters of the Atlantic. And you can also see these clouds that are out in the Atlantic are kind of running southwest to northeast as well. So eventually it's going to get carried out to the northeast. The steering flow is very weak at the moment, so I would expect this to just kind of sit here for the next day or so. But along about Wednesday, we're going to start to move this to the north and then eventually kick it away to the northeast. I don't know how much development you can get out of this. However, you do have that upper trough swinging in and that cold front approaching that's going to basically punt this system out to the northeast. Sometimes you can get that energy from those deep troughs to sort of energize these lows as they move along. And on occasion, they can get quite strong. So we have to pay attention to it, obviously, as it's moving northeastward. Some of the models bringing it over Nova Scotia and Newfoundland toward the latter, late this week, late on Thursday and beyond, and going up into Newfoundland and then northeast from there. So we'll be watching to see whether if this does become a tropical storm, that you could wind up getting energized in the way that non-tropical storms get energized. So back to the models, we'll take a look at what's happening this week as far as the overall pattern is concerned. And once again, at least for the Northeast and the Northern Mid-Atlantic states, we're seeing the same pattern. This is from this afternoon, that upper low sitting in Nova Scotia, over Nova Scotia, that energized the surface low. The next trough swinging into the east, that brings our cold front for Wednesday. The trough will lift out, and there's a secondary short wave that moves in for Friday night and sets us up, I think, for a pretty decent weekend. There's still another short wave that follows for Sunday night and Monday. But notice the flow by Monday, that the southern part of that jet stream goes pretty far south into Virginia and North Carolina, where you have northwest winds in the upper atmosphere. Clearly, this is not an upper air pattern that would bring a system up the east coast. If, let's assume that Dorian does make its way over into Florida, my suspicion is it'll probably, if that were to happen, we'll probably see it eventually get into Georgia and then die out somewhere in the southeastern states, and then eventually find its way offshore off South Carolina, getting caught in the southern part of this northwest flow that's going to be here for the first week of September. Next shortwave marching along late next week, another one that follows, and a fairly amplified one for the first full week of the month of September, if the model verifies. This is far out in the long range, so we want to be careful about this. But the bottom line is that at least through it looks like through the first 10 days of the month that we're going to be still under the influence of the same old pattern. The GFS continues in the long range to try to bring the jet back up at some point, or maybe around the 11th or 12th. It keeps doing this from run to run. It keeps pushing it back. So we view that with a little bit of skepticism, certainly. Look, eventually all patterns have to break down, but this one's been persistent for quite a while. The late day run. Let's go back down to the tropics. I want to show you the wind shear issue, and we're going to back this up a bit. We're going to take a look at the upper air conditions here, and why we have to be a little bit careful. So this map we're looking at way up, 25,000, 30,000 feet. There's Dorian, the 1,006 low that you see there on the lower right. The thin lines and those arrows, we're looking at the highs and lows that are in the upper atmosphere. So Dorian is sitting the surface low representation with that L, but if you look at the arrows, the winds over it are clockwise. There is an upper high sitting over the storm. This creates a light wind shear environment and a way for the air to be evacuated out of the hurricane, lifted up and out. So you're seeing very favorable conditions for strengthening, but we have that dry air issue which has been holding it back. When we get this into the Caribbean, the upper high weakens to a certain extent, and you do have strong winds in the upper atmosphere. That area of yellow and orange, you do have some wind shear issues going on. I'm going to pull up a sounding in one particular point, and as we run up into the higher levels above 18,000 feet, you're seeing 15, 20, 15 knots of shear. I mean, there is some shear here that may get in the way. The GFS is actually showing a bit less in the way of shear than what it has been showing in prior runs. Now, once we get it over onto the other side, if it makes it to the other side of the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico and heads into the Bahamas, the wind shear environment here is very favorable for development. Light upper air winds covering a large portion of the Bahamas and the area off the southeast coast of the United States. So this is why the Hurricane Center is advancing the idea that when it gets to the other side, and they have some of their longer range models showing that we could see intensification quickly when it gets there, assuming there's something left. You're going to put it in an environment where you could wind up getting this to strengthen again. The European model was interesting because starting with last night's run, it actually, for the first time, and it did it again today, it actually shows an identifiable surface feature, which you can see. Actually, we're looking at 5,000 feet. Let's see if I can find the surface version of this map. Let's see, where are we? Let's try... let's try this one. So there's Dorian, and it holds together a definable feature. Really doesn't take it over the Dominican Republic directly, over the Bahamas, moves it west-northwest and northwestward, and it never really strengthens it very much. but this is the first time we're actually seeing a viable feature on the European model. And the European model's upper air, by the way, is pretty much the same idea as the GFS, where it builds this upper ridge to the northeast of the storm and then builds it back westward, merges it with a narrow. So what you wind up really is just a narrow east-west ridge and a brick wall and a southeast flow from the Dominican Republic to Florida, and that's the path that it winds up taking. So at this point, we're at Monday, and we're talking about if there's going to be something that's going to threaten the Bahamas and Florida. We're talking about the end of the week and going into this coming weekend. So there's certainly plenty of time to watch it. And hey, if that wind shear is a real issue, there may not be much to watch here. So just bear that in mind. There's no guarantee that this thing is going to remain intact in the way that it's being described by some models. There are certainly some models indicating otherwise. So bear that in mind. And by the way, the GFS even today on the latest run, you see how small this is? It loses it. By the time it gets to the Dominican Republic, you can barely find it. You can sort of follow the precip along, and then eventually it just kind of does something with it when it gets it into the Gulf of Mexico and brings it onto the northwest. So I suppose that when you go look at this in terms of the overall scheme of things, that all things are possible with respect to the longer term. The system along the East Coast, you can see it here how the GFS handles it. Keeps the low very, very broad. That may or may not be correct, and then takes it just southeast of the Gulf of Maine and just south of Nova Scotia as a not really well-developed system. But of course, if we wind up seeing it become tropical and getting juiced up by the cold front that's coming through on Wednesday, and you can see it here right on the coast, that cold front is there, then you might be dealing with something a bit stronger. The next front follows for Friday night into early Saturday, and that allows this big high to build in for Saturday and into the weekend. The GFS has been trying to show some moisture coming out of the middle Mississippi Valley. For those of you concerned about the Labor Day weekend in the northeast and mid-Atlantic states, it sort of backed off on it today. It's very similar to what we're going through now, with the high going by just to our north, and you get an onshore flow that sets up for Sunday that may or may not produce some clouds. Then it has now it's got something coming through early Monday morning, another weak front of some sort coming through. But I'm kind of skeptical about this after the first part of the weekend because of everything that's going on elsewhere with regards to Dorian, and of course with whatever winds up happening with the system along the East Coast. So pretty interesting scenario certainly that we're going to be looking at going forward. And of course you can keep up to date with it with my free weather app, my websites, and my presence right here on YouTube, because we will be live streaming, of course, every day this week. And don't forget, in the mornings, you get a quick update anyway with Weather in 5, which I do pretty much every day. Here's WPC's map. Now, this is a good map to use here because of the fact that we know how well they tend to do, and we can kind of glean an idea here of what they're thinking. And you notice Florida is covered in big rains of 3 to 5 inches plus for the next 7 days. And I imagine that this is probably back-end loaded. So they may have already looked at with this and saying, hey, at the very least, if we don't wind up getting something directly, we may wind up getting a lot of the residual tropical moisture in that southeast flow coming into Florida. So it looks like they're leaning in that particular direction. Not a whole lot of rain for parts of North Carolina into Virginia. Then it picks up a little bit when you get up into the northeast with the two fronts coming through. Again, a lot of that's convectively driven, so that's always difficult to figure what it's going to be. And there never seems to be a lot of uniformity. Some spots get a lot, some spots get a lot less. Still got that bullseye of heavy rain sitting in Kansas and parts of Missouri and the Central Plains. Very quiet out in the western part of the U.S. The Storm Prediction Center with respect to any kind of severe weather that we have going on tonight, and I'm going to pull up a couple of other maps too. We've got 2 working small severe thunderstorm watches in Missouri and in parts of southern Illinois. You got a large area of slight risk there, and an even larger area of marginal risk in the plains and in the middle Mississippi Valley, and then another small separate area that they have sitting from Chicago southward, either side of the Illinois-Indiana border. Nothing going on in the east. It's not often that you can run this line down into South Carolina this time of year and not see any thunderstorms, but it shows you the extent of the impact of the dry air in the east. And of course, it's pretty much bone dry out in the west. So I want to pull up a couple of maps, see if we can get some observations with what's going on up in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland with this surface low that is moving there. This observation map actually gives some pretty extensive obs, and we'll put the counties on there. I always like to put the counties on, and let's just make this a little bit darker. We'll put the satellite. And I think the other thing I want to do is I will add the dew points. By the way, you can find this on the Mount Holly National Weather Service website. It's right on their homepage. So it's weather.gov/PHI. Or just go to weather.gov and click in and around southern New Jersey, and you'll be able to pull it up. So let's put a few extra obs, stick on the dew point, and let's get rid of that. So let's take a look. By the way, notice, nice to be sitting in dew points in the low to mid 50s for the 3rd day in a row. What an absolutely delightful day it was today, with temperatures not getting out of the low 70s. And you've got some temperatures at this hour at 7 o'clock, 50s up in parts of Maine. So let's jump over to Nova Scotia. And Bavin Island reporting a north-northeast wind at 36 miles an hour. Hart Island is north-northeast at 17. We've got a buoy out here. Sable Island is northeast at 46. So they're blowing away in Sable Island. Checking out some of these obs in Newfoundland, very light winds here, so they're not seeing a whole lot of impact at all. Winds are mostly light and variable. Broken sky, so it's not even completely overcast. They're not giving a sky condition here. And Port au Basque, I hope I said that right, for my Canadian friends that watch me and my friends from Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. East-northeast at 8. Humidity's pretty high, though, 61.56 dew point. Oh, boy. Îles de la Madeleine, I hope I got that close. That is 62.57 north-northeast at 5 miles an hour. This particular tool is great to have, because especially when it comes to these tropical systems, you can be able to see some of these wind obs with the buoys. And this one that's way out offshore is reporting an east-southeast wind at 42 miles an hour. So your low center is probably somewhere in between Sable Island and this buoy that's out to the east. Let's see if we can. I don't know if we can get obs down in the islands. Yeah, we actually have a few, and in fact, let me see if we can add some more. So hang on one second. We're going to add a few more. Okay. So let's go with 2 times to add a couple of extra obs. So Barbados right now at Grantley Adams International Airport, and this is going to pass fairly close to Barbados shortly, east-northeast at gusting to 35, sustained at 21. And do they have rain being reported? Yeah, light rain and some thunder. So they are getting some weather here from Dorian. It's going to pass very close. And then after that, probably St. Lucia, which right now is east-northeast at 15, so there's nothing out of the ordinary there in a partly cloudy sky. It doesn't pick up with the radar echoes down in this particular area, but this is going to be useful in the next few days, especially if we wind up getting something, if we wind up seeing Dorian run up close to Puerto Rico. We'll have all these observations to be able to look at, and that certainly will make things, from the terms of getting information, we've got a lot of extra stuff that we'll be able to look at. And I just realized, I guess I pulled you guys off the screen and didn't bring the window up to show you. So I'm sorry about that. Let me bring it up really fast. I get very excited when we're doing this stuff, trying to get all this information out there, and I forgot because I was doing the other maps. But this is the site from Mount Holly, weather.gov/PHI, and it's right on their homepage. You'll see it in one of the boxes. Just click on it, set the parameters you'd like, and right now, as I said, I dragged it down to the islands, and just a little before that, I had it up into Canada. If it loads, we can bring it up here. I'll show you guys one more time. Well, showing it to you for the first time because you didn't see it the first time. But it'll plot the obs, and then if you hover your mouse over the points where you have the obs, it'll bring up the full observation. So again, very, very useful tool for dealing with these tropical systems and even the non-tropical systems when they come into play. By the way, on the U.S. satellite loop, we can see that low that's up in Canada there, southeast of Nova Scotia. Big swirl of clouds and the dry air that came in behind it into the northeast. Not quite. The clouds are starting to get into Newfoundland now. You're seeing solid overcast over Nova Scotia and over New Brunswick. And then you also see the next cold front that is out to the west. The first line of showers, that's actually the warmer, more humid air coming in ahead of it. The cold front is the second area of clouds further back that's going to be producing the severe weather, possibly in Illinois and Indiana, and points to the south where we have the risk areas up. But that is where the cold front is that's going to reach the East Coast on Wednesday. And that will be the punter for the system offshore to kick it away to the northeast. So 7:45 Eastern time right now. Remember, whenever you are watching these on a replay, obviously everything is dated, so please go to your local National Weather Service office forecast page to get the latest weather information, particularly when it comes to severe weather. You want to go to weather.gov. And with respect to the hurricanes and tropical storms, nhc.noaa.gov. On the board with you guys tonight. Nice to see you here. Got a nice little crowd. Ben McInnes, how strong do you think the winds will be from TD6 when it hits Nova Scotia? Ben, that's kind of hard to say. If it remains broad like it is now, I don't know that it would stand out amongst any other ordinary low that moves up. I think what we have to look for is if it winds up being influenced by the cold front and upper trough that's swinging into the east on Wednesday, that might juice it up a bit. In which case, you could wind up with some gales if it gets going, and we've seen systems get energized quite a bit in a non-tropical fashion. So certainly we'll revisit that question tomorrow. Right now, I would say this system all along has been. Remember, we've been watching this thing since last Thursday. It's taken all weekend until today to finally get a low-level circulation to develop. So it has been very, very slow to get going. You wonder whether it may just be that way through its entire life cycle, that it may just wind up staying as this, broad surface low that never really gets much beyond a depression, or maybe it makes it to minimal tropical storm and not much more than that. I believe that's what the official Hurricane Center forecast is with that says the second one. And did I bring up... hold on, I want to just make sure I did this. Let me just show you the really fast. Let's just bring up the Hurricane Center's forecast for Tropical Depression number 6. It's one of the two systems we're watching. And by the way, the Pacific has completely shut down, which is usually what happens when the Atlantic revs up. So here's the Hurricane Center's forecast. They do strengthen this to a tropical storm and take it northeastward, very close to Nova Scotia. And by the time you get to that, where it has the S there, that is at the point where it's become post-tropical. But their official forecast is for it to be a minimal tropical storm, but they did acknowledge in their discussion that it could wind up getting energized a bit more. 31.7, 72.5, top winds 35 miles an hour, and an official motion of east at 2 knots, which means it's really not moving very much at all. And it probably won't until you get that cold front to swing in, and the upper trough to swing into the east. And at that point, you'll probably wind up seeing it start to move along to the northeast. All right, Bobby Livingsworth, you've been having dreams about a major hurricane strike in South Carolina next month. Okay, yeah, I know. You always know who the weather lovers are, because they're the ones that have dreams like that. And I get it. I understand what you're getting at. We really don't want a major hurricane to hit anywhere, but certainly the month of September into the first part of October, you're going to have something going on somewhere, and the risk is there. Mr. Briller, the chairman, thank you for hitting Super Chat tonight. You do that a lot, and I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thank you. They're very kind. Cup of coffee and a cigar for me. And as I said, it makes me a very happy camper. Somebody is saying that hurricane seasons have not been active. Remember that, Bobby, that there's the number of storms in a year is not the same as the number of storms that make landfall. Those are two different sets of numbers. Above most of the years, we've had very few below normal hurricane seasons in the last 15 or so years. They've all pretty much been either near or above normal, and that's because the vast majority of storms never hit land. You have to remember that. You get a landfall. The U.S. landfall, I forgot what the stat is specifically, but it's not one every year. I think it might be less than that. So, landfalling hurricanes don't happen too often, and thankfully they don't happen too often. You get one we had with Hurricane Michael last year. I mean, that certainly did catastrophic damage in the Florida Panhandle. You don't want those storms to hit or go back to a year like 2005 or 2008 when it was extremely busy. Johnny Quest, thank you so much. Thanks, Johnny. I really appreciate it. All of you that have hit Super Chat tonight, Christopher, PRJ Grudge, Scott Briller, and Johnny Quest. Thank you so much for doing that. And, you're a vital part. All of you are a vital part of this audience. You're here every single day. And some of you are on 2 or 3 hours before the live streams start, because when I schedule them, the chat opens up. So you can jump on the chat at any time. And I'm in there sometimes, depending on how much work I got on my hands. If I have some free time, I try to get in there. Alfred Phillips, thanks you. Alfred Phillips from Wainwright, Alaska, virtually at the top of the world. I'm kind of curious, Alfred, how long before the ocean up by you freezes over? I've watched the various nature programs that are on. The Hunt is on Netflix, which is very good. That's not the movie that they canceled. This is a David Attenborough series that is very good. I highly recommend it, about the relationship of predators and prey in nature. And they went to various places around the world, and they showed the polar bear, how the polar bear, when all the ice is melted, resorts to scaling sides of cliffs where birds nest and raids those nests for the eggs, because the polar bear can't get seals unless the ice is there. So it's pretty interesting to see that. So I'm kind of curious as to at what point in the fall does the ice start to where it freezes up by you. Timothy Veltman, another one of our regulars, hitting Super Chat tonight. Thank you so much. all of you tonight. I really, again, appreciate very much your generosity. I'm running through the chat backwards, just to make sure I don't miss any questions. If I do miss your question, you can always put it on the comment section of the video, or you can message it to me on Facebook, or any one of a number of different places. I'm not very hard to find. You're right, Ben McGinnis. Je ne parle français. So I do need to brush up seriously on my French. But please tell me that at least I got it close. Okay? I really hope that I got it close. And you said you barely got any rain in Halifax. I did notice this afternoon that most of the rain was east of you. The GFS model on this was wound up being a bit overdone, but it still developed into a fairly nice-looking little cyclone there that formed out of the upper low. St. Martin has been through multiple hurricanes, but two specific hurricanes that really hit us hard: Luis in 1995, yes, and Irma in 2017. Gerard Stapleton, and are you on St. Martin tonight watching this YouTube live stream? Welcome aboard, and let your friends know, because we'll be doing coverage here, as we do with all the have for the last several years with these tropical storms and these hurricanes. So I think that pretty much covers it. I guess he is. Gerard, you are on St. Martin. I've been to St. Martin many, many years ago. Beautiful island. I forgot which way it goes in St. Martin. At the time when I went, this was back in the 80s. I know you can gamble on one side, but you can't go bathe nude. On the other side, you can't gamble, but you can bathe nude. And I forgot which side is which, if it's the Dutch side or the French side. Somebody needs to remind me. Those are one of those things that happens when you get to the age of 60. You start flipping things back and forth, and you don't remember if it involves two different factors, A and B. A becomes B, B becomes A, and on some days, A and B becomes unrecognizable. It becomes C, D, and E. So it can be very frustrating trying to recall all of this, especially stuff from many years ago. Okay, so I think that kind of wraps it up here for tonight. Thank you very much. Nice long live stream tonight, 7:55. So we've gone over 50 minutes. That's nowhere close to my record, which I think is somewhere around an hour and a half. Dan Kumar, thank you. Appreciate it. Weather in 5, by the way, in the morning actually allows me to draw a bit easier than here. It's a little cumbersome bringing the paint box up because I have to do a few technical maneuvers. Whereas when I do weather in 5 in the morning, I can draw on it. It's a lot easier for me to draw on it. I guess it was more. What's my opinion, Anthony Orr? I'm sorry. Did I miss your? You said I didn't leave a question. I guess it was more of an observation. What was my opinion on it? Okay, let me just pull up your message. I'm thinking because you messaged me on Facebook. Let me check what you. Let me reread what you said, because I did read it. I just don't remember what it was I read. Again, brain freeze, and my computer's just taking its time loading right now because I got too many things spinning in the background. So I'm going to close a few things off, but not the live stream. All right. So Anthony Orr, you said to me, well, we talked about the dry air disrupting, which we discussed, and you told me about the depression. So I'm not sure what observation that you're referring to. So just type it into the chat there, and if not, send it over to me on Facebook, and I'll oh, it's in the YouTube chat. Well, I can't seem to find it. So I cannot seem to find it. I'm scrolling back. Oh boy. I'm sorry, Anthony. I'm not seeing it. So, oh, here we go. I'm going to try this again. The models overplayed wind shear with Michael. Perhaps they're doing it with Tropical Storm Dorian to some degree. You know what? This is our first real test since Hurricane Michael, and it's also a new test with the models with respect to the upgrades that they've done. So we are kind of learning as we go to see how they're handling this. The one thing I didn't take a look at today is the Canadian model, because I did notice, we've been noticing even with the Canadian model that it hasn't been spinning things up as readily as it has in past years. Now, without bringing it up on the window, it barely acknowledges that the storm is even there right now. So it's already in error, but it does have an identifiable feature that it actually starts to strengthen once it moves it up into the Bahamas, across South Florida and the Keys, and gets it into the Gulf of Mexico. That's the Canadian solution. And without looking at its upper air, it's hard for me to know why it's doing what it's doing. But the Canadian did not really pick up on it until later in the forecast period. The old GFS, which is still available, the GFS Legacy, let's see how that handled it. Now, it does show, has a pretty good, decent representation of Dorian moving into the Caribbean, actually strengthens it as it approaches Puerto Rico and over to the other side, and takes it over the Bahamas and across into Florida going into this weekend. So that kind of looks like what the Hurricane Center did. If you look at what the Hurricane Center's forecast is, it sort of looks like the Legacy GFS. And the Legacy GFS is the old GFS before the upgrade, which is available in a limited way on Tropical Tidbits. If you click on Global and scroll down to GFS Legacy, you can bring up the GFS and you can use the tropical sector in order to examine it. So looking at what the GFS has done, it is having the Legacy GFS, and I'm just examining, again, off the window in terms of the shear. I mean, it still has this well-defined upper high. It keeps that upper high intact all the way across. And actually, the Legacy GFS, I would argue, has a less, let's call it a much less unfavorable environment when it heads northwestward through the northeastern Caribbean. So models seem to be trending away from the European has trended away from the shear idea. The GFS seems to be the only one right now that has a fairly aggressive upper air look across the northeast Caribbean, and the old GFS has definitely backed away from it. Okay, so let's at this point we got to call it a day because it's 8:01 and I got some other stuff to do. So again, thanks everybody for being here. And by the way, for those of you who are interested, I'm doing extra coverage with regards to with regards to Dorian and whatever other tropical systems we have going forward on my weather platform on Patreon, which is just $2 a month. And I've just put the link up on the chat there for those of you who are interested. And for those of you who are members, you're always here on these live streams every night. Thank you very much for being here. My free weather app is available on Google Play or on the App Store. Just download, just search Joe Chaffee or meteorologist Joe Chaffee. If you have an Android device, the new app is updated so that it will default to your location when you pull up your local forecast page, and it has Zoom radar on there, and you get a lot of stuff that I posted. Frank Russ, thank you so much for joining Patreon. I really appreciate it. And feel free to message me anytime with questions or comments. Got a nice little active group there, and they always seem to they get more active when we get into storm season, and when we get into the winter storm season in particular, it gets quite active. So by all means, join in the fun. Message me anytime, and thanks for being here. Okay, so the schedule for tomorrow. Thank you, Anthony, by the way. Weather in 5. Tomorrow morning, we'll give you a quick update in about 5 or so minutes. And then, of course, we'll have our regular live stream tomorrow night at 7 o'clock Eastern Time. Chantel M., the app won't accept your location on the iPhone. That the update for the iPhone has not been put through by Apple yet. We're having some trouble trying to get them to update the app. Hopefully, it will go through soon. I've been sending emails out that haven't been getting responses. You should be able to go. There's a default location on the app the way it was originally created, where you have to manually go in and put your location in every time on the local forecast page. The new updated version, you won't have to do that anymore. So, but unfortunately, it's not available yet on the iPhone. It is available for the Android devices, and I'm hoping that tomorrow I will get an email saying that the update has been put through. As soon as it is, I'll let you know. And if you have an iPhone and you're active on the app, you'll know because the update will arrive and the app will update. So keep your fingers crossed that we can get this resolved. And by the way, just a quick reminder with respect to notifications, because I know a number of you have said to me how you don't always get notifications of the live streams and videos, and I was doing a little research on that. YouTube, a lot depends on what kind of traffic YouTube is experiencing in general, as far as how notifications go out and how many get out there. If you'd wind up doing something at the same time someone else is that is getting 10 million, that has 10 million subscribers and is getting 10 million notifications going out, your traffic may be cut back. So it's a little bit of potluck sometimes. But make sure that your phone notifications are turned on. If you're using a YouTube app, make sure that those notifications are turned on as well. Okay, and make sure that inside when you subscribe, that on the website, if you do it via a web browser, make sure that the notifications are turned on in all three of those places, and that should resolve your issue. Okay, folks, thanks for being here. Thanks for those of you who hit Super Chat tonight. Thank you, Frank, for joining Patreon and any new members that join. And we'll see you tomorrow night on the Joe Chaffee Weather Show.